Also goes without saying, if type in the chat if you want to interrupt us. I got it open.
Well, I think that we can go ahead and get started.
One swig of water, yep.
All right. The topic of today's conversation, and it really is going to be just that, a nice conversation about critical thinking and some of the assessment findings that we found in our evaluation last year, and our strengths, our weaknesses, and things that we can do in the classroom to really build and change those weaknesses to strengths. So really a lot of this is going to be a conversation about that, but hearing from you what's working in the classroom, what we've done or what I've done, and just different ideas that we have to help facilitate a little bit of those critical, more higher level critical thinking activities. So with that being said, I'm Krysti Reece. I am health career faculty. I'm the DMS coordinator. And I also am the chair of the academic assessment committee, those that don't know that. And I am excited to pair with Derek here to give this presentation.
Sure. Thanks, Krysti. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Derek Salinas-Lazarski. I'm the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences. I'm a member of the assessment committee, and I've worked on assessment and done many of these gen ed cycles. I've been at Triton for 2 years, but my previous institution, I was also heavily involved with this kind of assessment work. So I want to start from like a way more administrative perspective on this to give you all like the background, and then we'll move into more of the concrete pedagogy and stuff, etc. So as you all know, every school and Triton College has our 5 general education learning outcomes. So these are the outcomes that we say that kind of attached to our mission statement. These are the outcomes that that we say when a student finishes an associate's degree here at Triton College, they will have developed their thinking and cognition to our standards in these 5 areas: critical thinking, communication, information literacy, quantitative literacy, and global learning. If you want more information about this, you can go go to the Triton webpage, or just Google Triton College General Education Outcomes, and there's more of a description of each one. Now, regarding assessment, we need to make sure that we're actually teaching these outcomes to our students. We have to make sure and be able to prove that we're doing what we say we do. And so in order to do that, the assessment committee and the college as a whole has to assess whether or not we're doing these things. Well, that is a simple question with a gigantic, complicated process attached to it, okay? The shorter it is, every year we need to assess one of these 5 things. And we'll talk more about what that process looks like in a second, but we assess it, we figure out the areas in which we're doing well, the areas in which we need some improvement, and then we close the loop. And that's exactly what this presentation is that you are attending right now. This is the loop closing. So we're going to talk about the gen ed assessment that we did in the spring of 2020 of our critical thinking and how we teach critical thinking at the college. And we're going to talk about the things that we did well, the things where we need to improve, and we're going to give you concrete strategies here so we can disseminate, we can improve as a college. We can also tell the Higher Learning Commission, show them that we've done this assessment, that we're serious about self-reflection and serious about improving on our areas at the college. And we're also going to talk about what's coming up next. We're working, Krysti and I have an assessment meeting this afternoon. We'll talk about how to assess communication. So that's what's coming next in the pipeline. Well, let's talk about critical thinking. So the way that we define critical thinking here at Triton College, if we go to that webpage, is to explore issues, ideas, artifacts, and events before accepting or formulating an opinion or conclusion. And that is kind of a paraphrase of the AAC and U's definition of it, so we kind of borrowed from that. If anyone remembers seeing, I've given a presentation in the CT a few times over the last couple of semesters about critical thinking, using questions to spark critical thinking, and in that presentation, I give many different definitions of critical thinking because there are so many. Okay, so we got to keep that in mind, and I'm thinking about Tuan right now, talking about developing critical thinking in a math class, because looking at this definition doesn't immediately, exploring issues, ideas, artifacts, and events isn't, I'm not seeing arithmetic there. You know what I mean? We'll get into that in a second. So this is our definition. The areas, the specific areas that the American Association of Colleges and Universities Value Rubric allows us to assess critical thinking on are the explanation of issues, evidence, the influence of context and assumptions, students' positions, and then conclusions and related outcomes. And let me just go over how we did this assessment, and I don't have the specific numbers right here in front of me in this presentation, but I could get those if anyone is interested. What we do is we survey every single course at the college has to denote and submit to the curriculum committee which gen ed outcomes that it is teaching to the students. So what we did is we did a sample. We made a list of all the courses at the college that denote critical thinking as one of its learning outcomes. And then we did a random sample. We worked with Korean to figure out how many student artifacts we would need for a valid research project. And it was about 200, give or take. And so what we did was we used that list of courses and we selected at random, I believe it was like 12 to 15 courses, contacted the instructors, told them that the course had been selected for this particular study. What they had to do then was not change any of their assignments, but on an upcoming assignment, tell their students to turn in 2 copies of the assignment, one with their names on, one regular, and the other one with their names and their identifying information removed. Okay? Then we collected those 12 or 15 classes worth of assignments, and we found an afternoon where we, as a committee, were able to all get together and read them according to the rubric. Now, before this, a week or two earlier, we all got together and we went through the rubric, and here's the rubric right here. We went through the rubric and we did a norming session. So we looked at some papers, we talked about the rubric. I'm not expecting you to read this right now, just listen, but you can see it. We talked about the rubric, we did a norming session, so we were kind of like on the same page as to what certain phrases and certain language in this document really entailed. And then we spent, it was like 4 or 5 hours on a Friday going through and using the rubric to evaluate about 160 to 180 student papers. We made sure every paper had at least 2 reads, and we had a 3rd read pile in case people were on the fence and didn't know and they wanted some backup. So we did that 3rd read if necessary. For each one, a stack of these rubrics on the table. This is pre-COVID times. We just stack of these rubrics and you filled out the rubric. Then later, the assessment committee took all those rubrics and crunched all of the data. And you can see here, we have the explanation of issues, the evidence, influence of context and assumptions, student position, conclusions, and related outcomes. The highest score that a student could get was a 4, all the way down to a 1. And I gotta tell you, we had English classes, we had business classes, we had automotive classes, we had a psychology class. This was kind of brutal. We had a whole stack of papers. Each paper was about a different serial killer. We had to go through and read them all. And many of them were very good, but we were not disappointed when that pile was gone. The point being, the artifacts that we had really spanned the entire college, and that was very refreshing because we had so many different faculty and in the room. Doing this, we had about 10 people reading the artifacts. So it's very comprehensive, very interdisciplinary, kind of like exactly what this exercise should be, taking as comprehensive a look as possible at this one aspect of instruction at the college and engaging as many different faculty, staff, and admin, etc., for as many parts of the college as possible. So what we found, actually, I'm going to take this and make this easier. Let me go back, go forward, okay? So this is how we simplified the rubric in our group, whereas the rubric, you saw the official one is very text heavy, and we had lots of really interesting conversations, some debates about what would fall in what number, what did this phrase mean. It was exactly the kind of work that like really engaged in and like had our intellect sizzling and ego slightly bruised, as they should be. So this rubric that I'm showing you right now, which I believe Lauren Cosrow created because she was the assessment committee chair at the time. This is a way more simplified version of the rubric, and this is what we use. Or what I want to show you, because this is like our simplified interpretation of the rubric. At the end of the whole process, I'm backing up. These are the numbers, okay? So you can see we did not have any or many fours, and that makes a lot of sense because the AAC New Value Rubric is created for not just two-year colleges, it's created for four-year colleges as well. And so I know that we have those bright shining stars on our campus who can score fours in certain areas. But for the most part, at community college, our students are here still learning these skills. So it makes sense that they're not always going to score, fours, okay? However, this gave us some really good information that you can see most of our students did fall in the 1 and 2 mark for most of these categories. But an explanation of issues and evidence, presentation of evidence, we scored higher than, not higher, but our means were 1.8, 1.6. They were higher than the other categories. So we've got influence and assumptions, students' position, and conclusions and related outcomes. We were kind of on the lower half. And so, based on this data, what Krysti and I in the assessment committee wanted to do was let's talk about these areas. We could talk about explanation of issues and evidence. I'm happy to have that conversation, but I think we wanted to focus on the areas where we saw some need as a campus, which is why part of the reason we put this presentation together. And also, as a former English teacher, I've seen, to me, addressing context, assumption, and student position, those are the areas where I saw my students at the community college level having the most difficulty with regards to critical thinking. Like if there was a wall or a block or a hump that they needed to get over throughout the semester, and I saw that, it was in those areas. It was working in context, assumption, and position. So not to say that I wouldn't love to talk about issues and evidence, but I believe these are the ones that we kind of want to focus on right now. So I just did a lot of talking to my monitors, and we're gonna pivot in a moment. But I want to see, does anyone have any questions about the process that we had, the study, the rubrics, anything so far? Wow, Awesome. Either I did a good job or you're all asleep. I will take either one. So, could you explain student's position? Yes. So again, as a math instructor, like this is a really hard one. We would have to talk about like how that will come up in the math test. But a student's position is what's their thesis of the paper. So it's way more uh, fit more obviously fits in like an English class where it's like the instructor will give the students an article or a set of articles on say capital punishment, and then what's your position on capital punishment. And if we go back one, or let me go here, like explanation of student's position, acknowledges different sides is two. Position is stated, is it simplistic or obvious? Does it acknowledge different sides? Does it take into account the complexities of the issue? And then even further, does it acknowledge its own limits? So student's position is basically the case that student is making, their thesis, etc. Was that good? Did I explain that well? Okay. Cool. Explanation of issues. Did I get a 2 or a 3 on that one? One. Okay. Thank you. You're too kind. Any other questions before we move on? Cool. All right. So now we're gonna kind of transition. Now that I've given you like all the background, I will say one thing. Now we're working on communication. So moving forward, we're going to be this semester and next semester, we're doing the same thing, this giant study. We're talking about communication, and it's going to be broken into written communication, oral communication. We're still figuring out how that's going to happen. But just a heads up on that prior to me leaving all this talk about the study itself. So let me zip forward. And now we're going to talk about context. I'm gonna kick over to Krysti right now and just kind of run the board for a few minutes, as we're kind of working on developing our skills and addressing maybe some of our areas of need with regards to critical thinking at the college.
Yeah. So we're gonna turn the mic over to you guys for just just for a minute or two. Just to get your idea. So when you think about the influence of context and context in general, and noting that that's kind of an area of weakness in our students, in what context are students developing their critical thinking skills? So just to kind of food for thought there, any thoughts on that as we move forward, or any comments that you want to address when posing that question? All right. Oh, go ahead, Lisa. Lisa, you might be muted.
I'm sorry, I was.
Okay.
I'm in the ophthalmology department, and in my student's second year, they have 2 years. So in my student's second year, I give them critical thinking assignments where they're sort of case studies. And we give them symptoms in a picture of a patient, and they have to critically apply the symptoms and everything that they've learned. And we have them write down what their exam might show. And actually, I was just talking to my adjunct faculty about how much trouble they were having with it. But it's basically what they're going to need to do when they graduate. They're going to need to be able to assess a patient. And the students have a very hard time critically applying what they've learned and what the skills are for, and applying them to what every individual patient needs. And I've noticed that that is a difficult task because they're used to being students and they're used to just memorizing things and not putting them into context.
So this is great. So because we want to talk about how do we develop our students' context, we kind of pose this cute question of let's think about our students' context. So Lisa, that was great. So what are some qualities of the students' context, like the context that they're developing these critical thinking skills in them?
Well, because of that, and I started doing this 2 years ago. I implemented it in a few classes. Then last year, I implemented these assignments in every class, and just to get them thinking more like a tech while they're learning all of this information, and less like a student. So now I've started this last semester. I've started lecturing in more of a way of not really lecturing, but making them think like a technician. So I would lecture about a specific thing, and then I would put a case study up, and then I would walk them through the steps and basically teach them how to think like a technician. So listen to the patient's symptoms and then start asking questions that can eliminate what it isn't and hone in on what it is. And then that seemed to be helping, but I just recently gave a test last week and it was not as great as I would have liked it to be. So I just made another homework assignment, that same format with critical thinking and applying, the knowledge and the skill base that they've learned to the patient's symptoms and what disease or pathology it could be pointing to. So I'm anxious to see how they do on this next couple assignments, because now all of my assignments are going to be sort of case study based, to get them thinking more critically, because it's imperative in the medical field. When a patient gives you their symptoms, you have to be able to formulate an opinion as to what it could be and do some diagnostic testings that will help the doctor to determine the diagnosis.
I think that was such a great response and analysis, Lisa. I think for me, thinking about context, your students are developing their critical thinking skills in the context of this expectation of entering the professional world very soon, and they are working in the context of having to think like a tech and meet these standards very, very soon, especially if they're in their second year. They're working towards graduating, and a lot of them are working towards being in the field very soon. So I think that's the double-edged sword that you all play with over the H building, is that you're doing a great job using that to develop their thinking skills, using case studies, getting them to think as a tech. At the same time, that ratchets up the pressure, I imagine, and
Yes.
that can also add difficulty to it when there's already so much pressure as it is. That was great. Tuan, do you comment?
Yes, I was saying, for my classes, for all of you who don't know me, my name is Tuan Dean. I teach in the college readiness and the mathematics department. I'm also a part of the assessment and fellowship. And one of the things that I was going to elaborate on for my classes, well, especially my Math 80, which is the liberal arts math class, and well, we call it math literacy, but nevertheless, I also teach the liberal arts math class, which is the Math 102. And in both classes, what I decided to extend on in their critical thinking is to actually keep a journal of their knowledge of what they're doing in the course, and then also apply it to their field of expertise or their field of study or their future. Some of the questions that they have to write on is based on like I said, based on those three scenarios, but each time it's going to be different. And I also give a word constraint for that. And I thought that for my math literacy course, the Math 80, I wanted to extend on their critical thinking in the sense of designing a project sometime for April and May based on their discipline, because it is a small group, but I also wanted them to do my definition of critical thinking is more of the communication part, not only the writing, but the speaking as well too, in a professional development field or in a professional aspect, and then also in the social aspect as well too. So I'm still trying to develop those things, because I think it's imperative that students know how to speak with their colleagues and then also to friends or family or whomever in regards to whatever topic they're talking about, even though it's a math class. But I think talking about critical thinking across all the curriculums and bringing it into one class, I think is easy for students to understand the connection rather than just saying it's being taught in one course.
Like
Yeah,
this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say these are great strategies. These are great techniques in the classroom for sure to help facilitate kind of building critical thinking and adding context for sure. And really relevance, I think, is the more that we can show our students how relevant these critical thinking skills are to their future or to their current life, they really start to connect more with the material. All right, so Derek, you got to change the slides for me because I have no
Sure,
access.
yeah, I'm moving forward. I just want to say some of the other contexts that our students are developing their critical thinking skills in, COVID. On the heels of the current social justice movement we're in. Just the everyday life of many of our students being low income, first generation, working, adult. All of these are contexts that we need to recognize if we're talking about not just what our students are, but we're talking about specifically their critical thinking skills and how we're developing their critical thinking skills. All these contexts are relevant, and they're certainly far, far more. But if we're going to ask our students to identify context, we better be able to do it for them as well. Okay.
All right, so teaching context, really identifying all aspects of context. So culture, history, law, finance, geography. Every different area has its own context. So its own circumstances that really set the stage for whatever we're trying to teach or whatever point we're trying to get across. So it's really important that as we introduce new things to our students, as we expect them to critically think about situations and evaluate them, that we encourage them to learn more about the context of what we're teaching. So not just take it for surface value. Again, certain things lend themselves to that are very, very factual. But even with that, for my pathology course, there's certain demographics that are predisposed to certain conditions. And I don't just leave it at this is the case. I ask why. Why does this geographic region have this disorder? Or, in the United States, thyroid conditions are less prevalent than other areas of the world because we use iodinized salt, right? So knowing that history helps them, or that specific context related to the situation helps them understand the information a little bit better. So encouraging our students to really dive into the material is a way that we can help to really engage them in critically thinking more about the topics that we cover. Now, with that being said, it's not always easy, right, to pose the question, what else can we consider, right? Instead of just taking things at face value, this is what it is, what else can we consider? What else will impact that scenario, that situation? If this changes, what will that change? So these are the types of questions that we want to pose, and not always jump in for that answer, right? Because there's not always a concrete answer. That would be one side of the sword. And the other side would be that if we always jump into answer, they're not using their own inquisitiveness to gather that context and really connect. So some of the things, ways to encourage context understanding, would be connecting again with that historical and current events. So really taking the past, the present, what are these relevant things that are going on in the world or in different areas that are altering the way that the context may present. Is there alternatives, right? So yes, we see this specific way. Is there an alternative way of approaching or understanding or considering that material? What factors influence? And then also really, this is one of the biggest things I love is self-guided exploration into a topical area. And some people may think that, or students often think, I should say, that's kind of taking the easy road. They're just making me do these projects and research this and come back and report. But that's really that inquiry-based learning helps students fully dive into and understand those contextual basis.
Krysti, this reminds me of a funny story example that my psychology 101 professor gave us freshman year of college, which is that ice cream sales go up when high ice cream sales are correlated to high crime rates. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah. And so what conclusions do you draw from that? That criminals eat a lot of ice cream? It's true. Yeah. But this is such a great lesson in context because it makes so much sense. Most crime happens during the summer, and most people eat ice cream sales during the summer. That's the correlation. But if you leave that extremely important piece of context out, you see you could jump to all sorts of conclusions or even make conclusions about this day you shouldn't even be making. So I just gave that story to point out how crucial context is and how, you can never be truly exhaustive, but it's important to teach our students to be as well-rounded in their approach to a subject as possible.
And I think that leads well into our influence of assumptions. So what assumptions, I'm going to pose this question to you before we talk about the next section. What assumptions do we have about our students' critical thinking skills? Don't all jump in at once.
Or you can type in the chat if you like.
Absolutely.
I'll totally raise my hand for this one. I would like to say that I go in with full gusto that I think my students have amazing critical thinking skills, and then I give them an assignment to show me that they have amazing critical thinking skills, and then they come back with very vague answers. And so then I have to ask them, even like I then have to continue to ask them questions, and sometimes I feel like I'm pulling teeth to get them to really come up with an answer that isn't so vague or so, I don't want to use the word elementary, but it's, basic.
Yeah.
Yep. Your idealism set you up for disappointment. I'm totally
Yeah, I know,
guilty.
right? It's so sad.
Well, right. I think just really quick, you said vagueness and specificity. I think that's a really important part of like every aspect of critical thinking here is the answers that are vague or not specific usually are a sign that we want more critical thinking. Okay? Because in critical thinking, you want something that's specific, a specific answer that has a lot of good reasons why the student came up with that answer. So, I mean, that's not necessarily talking about assumption, but it's just a good general point about critical thinking. Thank you.
Tuan?
Assumptions about critical thinking skills? Tuan?
Yes. I often think that students, and it's funny because I'm in a math department, but I think that students in this case rarely have that critical thinking behind any questions that you may ask them. For example, I have a student where I asked them to write a summary about what they've learned and how it applies to their field. And I had a student write me an email and say, can you give us an example of what you mean? And I'm like, I giggled to myself. I'm like, that's the whole purpose of me trying to get you to think of how to apply that. And sometimes I always think that students sometimes think that we have to give them examples of everything because the fact that they may feel that we as instructors may think that they don't know, which that proved they didn't, but they just feel that we have to show them how to think in a certain way or write in a certain way of what our expectations are, even though we may have or tell them, like Gretchen may say as well too, in regard that my expectations of them are really low and I'm hoping that they excel over my expectations, but it just tends not to happen that way because they just come in with this idea that we just have to give them everything.
Right. I would say, Tawan, that I mirror your experience in every level, same as Gretchen's as well. My personal assumption is that most students hate critical thinking. And that's just from my personal experiences in the classroom. They want that solid answer, right? A yes or a no, or this is what it is, and well, but why can it be that way too? Is a question I often get. So I'm that way as well. I have a big project that I do. So an e-portfolio for one of my intro to imaging courses. And it's a Google site. I give a rubric, but nothing else. And everybody wants an example. Can I see what previous people have done? And I always tell them, but I want to see what you can do. I want to see you showcase your knowledge. You have the outline, right, based on a rubric, and they hate it. And I know they do. But it really, I want them to become their own individual. So, and really be creative and showcase themselves. So I definitely know what you're talking about with that, wanting the example and wanting a concrete, this is it answer. And in a lot of our critical thinkings, that's not the case. And that's the great part of it, is there's so many different lenses.
You're right, because one of the things on the rubric that I have for my students there during their summary journals, it's one of the areas is called thinking out loud. And I explained to them that I want you to explain to me what your thinking process was. So I called it thinking out loud because I told them, just tell me what your thinking process was, why you approached it, your writing in the sense of answering this question, or how you thought about it. But just, you know, at the time, I kept stumbling over myself and thinking, that's the only thing I can actually tell you as an example, because it's your own thought. And that's why I called it thinking out loud. And the other area they have on there is called creativity. And I told them that I want them to be creative in the sense of how they write it and who they're writing it for. Even though I'm the only person that's reading it, but just be creative in the sense that if I'm not there with you holding your hand, how would you explain it to me in the sense that I will enjoy it, love it, laugh with it, and maybe be sad with it as well too, but sympathize and empathize with you. And that's what we were talking about. And I'm thinking the first batch of journals were just horrible. And I think maybe I didn't explain it well enough, or they're just waiting for me to say, you like you said, yes or no in this case. And like, oh, yes, this was the answer, and yes, this can apply in my field. But they didn't elaborate on it. So there was a lot of feedback in the sense of telling them how to elaborate and also how to think as well too.
I love that, the thought process thing, because this is so much about training students' thought process. And it makes me think some assumptions that we may have are students might have really good critical thinking skills in one subject and not necessarily transferred over to a different subject. It's kind of like multiple intelligence theory a little bit. But the other thing is, just because your students aren't necessarily demonstrating critical thinking skills in your course, or even in school, doesn't mean that they don't have any, because I guarantee you our students, when they're engaged with their hobbies, when they're playing their favorite video game or doing whatever their favorite hobby is, they're definitely engaging their critical thinking skills because there's joy in it, right? So, I mean, they absolutely have it. Part of what the community, our instructors, you know, part of what we're trying to do is help channel those critical thinking skills into our particular subject areas. Yeah.
All right, so addressing assumptions. So we have our own assumptions, and there are ways that we need to also make sure that we address the assumptions of our students in the classroom. So really those accepted truths that don't have foundation, if you will, or past life experiences have just led to a certain way of thinking and believing. And ways to address these in the classroom would be using those open-ended questions. You know, why would you say that? Tell me more about that. What about X, Y, Z? So taking and using open-ended questions to allow for an alternative way of thinking, or at least an alternative theory or approach. There are good and there are bad assumptions. So all politicians are corrupt. All politicians have, you know, a difficult job. Those are examples of statements, you know, that maybe certain ones, all politicians are corrupt, is not necessarily true, you know, but could someone say that and assume that? Maybe, right? But show examples of biased thinking, right, versus perspective informed thinking. So, you know, instead of seeing it one way because of, you know, past experiences or assumed truth, here is an alternative thought process or an alternative assumption. Give them the tools to evaluate the entire context, the entire picture, if you will, and approach it more overall. So ways to challenge: encourage evidence-based exploration and understanding. So don't just assume something, prove it, right? So evidence-based practices, making sure that they use outside sources to back their perspective or approach. Respecting others is key and so important, especially when we have charged assumptions in the classroom, or topics that may be more sensitive. So respecting those alternative ones until proven otherwise, and then creating a culture of acceptance and exploration. So really facilitating that can be challenging, but when you create that openness and that acceptance in the classroom, then students are more open to listen. I think that's
This slide right here just makes me feel good. Like, I feel like we just need a big injection of this slide, that entire culture right now.
Any questions or comments so far on this stuff? I know we're gonna go over. Is that okay, Gretchen?
I think we'll be close.
Yeah, oh, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, perfect.
If anybody has to jump off, I'm sure they can do that.
Okay, all right. All right.
I think maybe the one other thing about assumption is recognizing when your students are making those assumptions, and then not like slapping them down for it right away. Like using the open-ended questions to be like, oh, why do you think that way? Have you considered this? Have you considered, instead of saying that's wrong or you shouldn't think that way, etc. While in some cases that might be true, is not going to develop their skills as well as gentle questioning to try to like lead them to some stronger critical thinking. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So the student's position, perspective, thesis, and hypothesis. What are some statements that we can make about our students' critical thinking or how we can approach them? Any takers on that one?
We want good, solid positions, not overly simple, taking context and assumption into account. We want force. Can you give us some force? Or maybe threes? That's fine. Okay, you know what? Here's what we're going to do, Krysti. No one wants to talk, so now they all get homework. So you all have 2 minutes. Everyone has to write one sentence in the chat in the next 2 minutes answering this question. Go. You have to write one statement about our students' critical thinking skills or how we can approach them. Can you phrase that as more of a formal statement, Krysti? Also, you shouldn't be doing this. You're the presenter. We need the participants working. Everyone should have a keyboard.
To elicit some thinking or some guiding here. Gentle guiding.
Let's off the hook here for 47 minutes. Not getting out here without giving us an answer. I'll sit here all day. I don't care. Start typing in the chat.
There we go.
That's. Thank you. Good. Good, Magdalena, Lisa. These are all excellent. See, you had it, and you come on. We want some more. Angela, Twan, Gretchen.
Yeah, I would say that the general consensus at this point is that they're not coming prepared with some of these critical thinking skills, right?
You know, I remember my critical theory class, which was the end of my freshman year in college. I could feel that class change my brain. I could feel that class teaching me how to think critically and approach every other class I had in a different way. And that was an English class for me, being an English person. But, you know, I don't necessarily want to say that we're wrong saying that they're not learning it in junior high or high school, but also they're bringing us the raw material to be able to work with to get them there too. So many of these students are going to have their critical thinking moment in your classes, and you are going to be the difference for them, and that's part of why we want to be doing this presentation, studying this, talking about this right now.
All right, so really students' position, perspective, thesis, hypothesis, taking their position and really considering other evidence and demonstrating that a logical thinking process, not just, I believe this, right? So I believe that, you know, the grass is green because X, Y, Z. But showing evidence or really showing a process of thinking and creating their own viewpoint with their own defense and their own backing. And it's not just what someone else says either, but being able to really talk you through. So squirrels are evil, right? That's just a fact. They just are. Versus squirrels have a variety of temperaments, but you should not trust them to babysit your garden. I love that. So very, very different as far as the position. Very just straightforward, no explanation, no depth or breadth to the first one, where the second one is a little bit more concrete, if you will. All right, so I know we've shared quite a bit already, but we really wanted to give this as far as time for us to talk about, and we've shared quite a bit already, the things that you've experienced in the classroom that have shown improvement in the critical thinking skills of our students. So any volunteers as far as additional things that you've done in the classroom that you've seen that have really fostered this higher level of critical thinking?
And that says you've already given us so many already. You've done so many great comments today.
Well, and I would say, Lisa, kind of to piggyback on your case studies, I use case studies a lot in the classroom, and I've been using them for years now, but I've learned to approach them differently now, to where I don't just always give them the case and the images anymore. Now I'll flip it backwards and give them a diagnosis, and then ask for them to make connections to, you know, here's the diagnosis. What's the typical patient? What is the typical appearance on an image? So kind of just piecing in different ways so that they don't just think of it only as here's a patient history, this is the image I expect to see. So that's something that I do as far as changing that up a little bit. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, even listening to everybody here, you know, I could take my, I call them cross conceptuals, where, you know, I'll give them, what I do is I tie one subject to another with questions. So, for example, you know, if somebody's nearsighted, you know, maybe they need a minus lens or a concave lens, but anatomically, why? So I tie the two classes together and I progressively do that. But I mean, I could take that even one step further and just do it rather than tying two classes together. I could just take it and say, okay, this patient has a lens inside their eye. What happens when it works? What happens when it doesn't work? Rather than they just learn what it does. So I could even break it down further to show them critically, you know, critically how to think about each component and then broaden it, you know, that way. It's, you know, it's hard. They just, you know, and I was just telling the students last week, you know, I was telling them they're compartmentalizing everything. They're learning something and they're memorizing it, but they're just learning it to learn it. They're not learning it fully in depth and applying it to how it works within the eye. And that's, it's challenging for me to keep coming up with different assignments in different ways to get them to not think like that. And also to get them to remember things from class to class, because a lot of times they learn something and then they purge it when the class is done. So they have room in their brain for the next class. And I keep, you know, so I'm like taking old assignments from a class 2 semesters ago and like re-giving it to them and tying it into what they're learning. But it's a constant challenge to keep them on their toes and keep them learning.
Yeah, I tell them that at the start of every class, every semester, the learning and losing is over.
Yeah.
We are
Yes.
covering everything from day one, because you never know when I'm going to pop something in there from before that you're responsible for. So I can relate to that for sure. I know one thing as far as making things, kind of putting things into context and things, one critical thinking thing that I do with my students is I have them, in our seminar course, we talk a lot about ethical considerations and true practice in the clinical field, because let's be honest, the textbook and true practice are not always aligned. And they come in and with these stories and they're very judgmental. Never saw this coming, but they get very judgmental about situations. And when I sit there and I say, okay, now consider, why would that tech have done that way? What was going on in that day or with that patient? And they're like, oh, I never thought of that. And they can really dive into situations that way too, and think of alternatives or why something was done differently. So
I think you're doing great, Lisa. I think part of it is scaffolding and like leading them. You're talking about like really higher level, like critical thinking assignments, but doing the work like Gretchen mentioned, Tuan mentioned, of like modeling their thinking and doing some intellectual hand holding to help them get to where you want them to be. But then also you mentioned something else, which is like kind of going back and tapping into the information that they previously learned. And you can keep braiding that, try to keep braiding it throughout the class and showing them that these are all tools in your intellectual toolbox. And especially for you all in health careers, like when you're in the field, you've got to have sharp wits, because you never know whenever you're going to need any of that information that you learned in school. So I think that's a really good point.
anything else?
Any other experiences on critical thinking you want to share? All right. Well, let's just give some closing thoughts. This isn't going to be the end of the conversation. This is already a great session. So please encourage your students to thoroughly explore the context before reaching a conclusion. Also, your friends, your neighbors, your family members as well. Too. Are we all guilty of this? It's so easy to do, but the more we can teach our students, yeah, exactly. Thoroughly explore the context and also thoughtfully consider their assumptions. I know when I find an assumption that I have that I'm not happy that I've held, it makes me want to swallow my tongue a little bit, but it is so important to critical thinking and to be a good thinker. Support your students in creating nuanced position statements that consider multiple viewpoints. Again, critical thinking is not really about simplicity. It may come to a simple answer, but if it does, it's because a lot of complex thought was put into it. So we want nuances in our positions and a lot of considering other viewpoints. And then what does this look like in your discipline? I started this off talking about Tuan. Tuan, I don't necessarily know what this always looks like in math, because you come to such concrete answers. However, I do know critical thinking is such an important part of math, and maybe part of this conversation is this definition, this rubric needs to be expanded to fit other disciplines. Or maybe you have some assignments that I'm not necessarily aware of that some of these things kind of fit into, and we have a wide range of disciplines here as well. So you're all the professionals who teach in your disciplines. I encourage you to take what we have here and kind of figure out the best way that it can work for you, or if you want to come back to us and give us some insights after tinkering with this or thinking about this, about how we can address critical thinking either in your specific discipline or in the college as a whole, we'd absolutely welcome that feedback. So, Krysti, I think I'm good. Do you have anything else to add?
You wrapped it up nicely. I think this is it. That's all, folks. We really thank you guys for coming and sharing in our conversation and sharing your experiences. And yeah, that's all we've got.
Thank you so much for being here, and we wish you rich, deep, critical thought for the rest of the semester.